They didn't send an emperor into exile. They set loose something far worse. A monster, Capri, 26 AD. The Mediterranean breeze carried both the sweetness of jasmine and the stench of decay, while the sea hammered against the jagged limestone cliffs. That island of just 12 square miles, which looked like paradise, would become Rome's most notorious prison. On the morning when Tiberius Caesar boarded his final ship bound for Capri, the whole city of Rome fell silent. Senators muttered prayers of relief under their breath. Citizens clutched their coins, wondering if this withdrawal meant safety or disaster. No one realized they were watching the beginning of a tale so dark that historians would still be arguing about it 2,000 years later. If stories like this, unmasking the corruption behind power, fascinate you, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always striking to see how these accounts of human greed and cruelty reach people across the globe. Tiberius Claudius Nero, his very name sounded like destiny. Claudius meant lame, Nero meant strong. He embodied contradiction, a man pulled between duty and desire, honor and brutality. Imagine him 6 ft tall at a time when most men were shorter, his broad shoulders hardened from carrying shields across German frontiers. His face carried the history of his battles, one scar above his left eye from a German spear, another carved into his jaw from a cavalry accident. Yet his eyes told more than the wounds ever could. Icy, calculating, the gaze of someone who had lived through so much bloodshed that death no longer frightened him, and so much betrayal that trust was impossible. Augustus had shaped him into a weapon, sharp, lethal, but fragile. Tiberius spent 22 years on military campaigns and 9 years governing Rome's most dangerous provinces. Every victory was paid for in Roman lives. Every peace treaty was signed in the blood of Roman soldiers. Tiberius was Rome's ultimate weapon, but weapons are meant to destroy, not to rule. And then there was Augustus, the stepfather, the godlike figure, the emperor who turned Rome from a republic into an empire while pretending nothing had changed. Augustus was elegance covering steel, sweetness hiding venom. For 45 years, he ruled by convincing everyone they were still free citizens, while in reality, they worshipped a god on a throne. But gods age and gods die. When Augustus finally took his last breath in 14 AD, he left behind an empire that no longer knew how to govern itself. The Senate was little more than a troupe of actors pretending to hold power. The people were hooked on bread and circuses, addicted to entertainment. The army existed only to conquer, not defend. Into this broken system stepped Tiberius, a soldier asked to be emperor, a weapon expected to govern, a destroyer suddenly ordered to build. For 11 years, he tried. Truly, he tried. He reduced imperial spending, reinforced Rome's frontiers, improved the legal system. He carried out every lesson Augustus had drilled into him. Efficient, ruthless, capable. But that was the problem. Rome didn't want efficiency. Rome wanted spectacle. The Senate despised him. They longed for Augustus's divine charm and resented Tiberius's relentless discipline. They wanted a smiling god emperor who would wave from balconies while they schemed behind the scenes. Instead, they got a general who examined every account, challenged every decision, and remembered every insult. The people despised him as well. Augustus had given them grand displays, gladiator contests that stretched on for weeks, chariot races that shook the Circus Maximus. Naval battles staged inside flooded arenas. Tiberius gave them none of this. Instead, he gave them financial restraint and military order. He was medicine when they craved wine. Worst of all were the old aristocrats, the noble families who had survived Julius Caesar and bent their necks for Augustus. They hated Tiberius with pure venom. He saw through them completely. He knew their hidden debts, their secret conspiracies, their quiet treasons. Augustus had played politics like a game of chess. Tiberius treated treason like an infection. He cut it out without hesitation. And then came 25 AD, the year everything collapsed. Sejanus, Lucius Aelius, Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, Tiberius's closest advisor, his most trusted friend, if Tiberius was Rome's sword, Sejanus was its poison. Where the emperor was blunt and severe, Sejanus was smooth and charming. Where Tiberius was feared, Sejanus was admired. For 8 years, he seemed the perfect lieutenant. He reorganized the Praetorian Guard into a single fortified camp just outside Rome. For efficiency, he claimed, he increased their numbers. For security, he placed his officers in key roles throughout the government. For loyalty, Tiberius mistook ambition for strength, manipulation for friendship. The hardened soldier, brilliant on the battlefield, never saw the coup taking shape in his own shadow. Then came the deaths. Drusus, Tiberius's son and heir, suddenly dead from a mysterious illness. In 23 AD Germanicus, the emperor's nephew and adopted son, poisoned in Syria. Back in 19 AD, one after another, the heirs to the empire fell to sickness, accidents, or unexplained fevers. Modern historians still debate the details, but the Romans of that time recognized poison when they saw it. Whispers spread through the aristocracy. Rumors passed quietly in the Senate, and every murmur seemed to echo the same name, Sejanus. Yet Tiberius trusted him. Against every omen, against every warning, he trusted. In 57 years of life, Sejanus was the only man who had never begged for money, titles, or favors. Only the chance to serve. That loyalty, real or false, nearly tore the empire apart. By 25 AD, Sejanus commanded the Praetorian Guard, swayed the Senate, and held the allegiance of half the noble families. He was emperor in everything but name. All he needed was for Tiberius to vanish, not die, just disappear. Let the old general retire to some villa and waste away in philosophy while Sejanus ran Rome. Let the emperor fade quietly while younger, hungrier hands took control. And so, Sejanus began his masterpiece, the slow destruction of Tiberius's will to rule. At first, it was small, almost invisible. Messages arrived a day late. Meetings were scheduled at the wrong hour. Senators suddenly had other, urgent business whenever the emperor called for them. Sejanus was an artist of isolation. He persuaded Tiberius that the Senate plotted against him, which was true. He reminded him that the common people mocked him, also true. He showed him that the aristocracy schemed in the shadows, undeniably true. But here lay Sejanus's brilliance. He never lied. He simply made sure every truth Tiberius heard revealed Rome as a pit of vipers, and left Sejanus as the only snake the emperor could trust. Step by step, document by document, conversation by conversation, Sejanus built a prison of paranoia around the emperor's mind, and Tiberius, worn down after 11 years of exhausting rule, began to believe that Rome might indeed be better off without him. The final blow landed in late 25 AD. This time, there was a genuine conspiracy. Senators and even members of the imperial family caught plotting treason. The details remain uncertain, but the result was clear. More executions, more trials, more anger against an emperor who seemed to see betrayal everywhere. Because he did. Because betrayal was there. Because Sejanus made sure there was always something to find. That winter, under Rome's gray skies, and even grayer politics, Tiberius reached his decision. He would leave the capital, just for a while, he told himself, long enough for tensions to calm, for conspiracies to collapse, for normal order to return. It was Sejanus who suggested Capri, beautiful, remote, easy to defend, a place where the emperor could rest while his loyal prefect took care of the daily burdens of government. Tiberius agreed. With that choice, the most powerful man in the world signed his own exile. AD springtime, the imperial galley cut through the morning fog toward an island that appeared like paradise, but would serve as purgatory. Capri rose out of the Tyrrhenian Sea, its white cliffs crowned with olive trees, its secret grottos carved by endless waves, its villas perched so high they seemed to touch the sky. Augustus had loved this place, turning bare rock into gardens and palaces, but Augustus had only visited. Tiberius came to stay. When his retinue arrived in April, they numbered in the hundreds: Praetorian guards, household slaves, scribes, cooks, entertainers, doctors, astrologers, philosophers, an entire government in miniature, packed onto 12 square miles of isolation. At first it seemed to work. Tiberius continued ruling by letter and courier, issuing decisions that shaped provinces from Britain to Egypt, all while gazing from terraces over fishing villages and merchant sails. He was still Caesar, still Augustus, still emperor, only now with better weather and no senators breathing down his neck. But isolation works like a drug. The first dose calms, the second excites, the third enslaves. By that winter, Tiberius had stopped reading many of the reports sent from Rome. By the next spring, he was ignoring requests from governors altogether. By 28 AD, the man who once obsessed over every detail of empire was spending his days reading Greek philosophy and his nights staring into the stars. The most powerful ruler on earth had turned himself into a hermit, and Capri became his cave. But what happens to power when it isn't exercised? It doesn't vanish. It festers. Tiberius still held absolute control over 60 million people. A single command from Capri could summon armies or reduce cities to ash. Yet those commands now came only when his mood, his paranoia, or his boredom demanded it. The signs of decline appeared slowly, then all at once. Servants whispered that whole days would pass with the emperor sitting silently, gazing out at the sea, as if he expected the dead to answer him. At other times, he exploded in fury over trivialities. A dish not prepared correctly, a letter that arrived late, a slave who moved too fast or too slow. The general who had once ruled vast legions now ruled only an island, and he ruled that island like a petty god. On Capri, nothing restrained him. Every indulgence was possible, every appetite was met, every whim was obeyed. There were no senators to challenge him, no citizens to judge him, no traditions to hold him back. For the first time in his life, Tiberius was completely free, and the result was utterly terrifying. But here we must stop and confront a problem with our sources. Nearly all accounts of Tiberius's behavior on Capri come from historians writing decades later, men who despised him. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio are our main witnesses, but they wrote for audiences that remembered Tiberius as the tyrant who had executed their fathers and grandfathers. Even more important, in Roman history, it was almost a rule. Unpopular emperors had to be accused of sexual corruption. Caligula was smeared with charges of incest, Nero with matricide and perversion, Commodus with humiliating gladiator games. The pattern is so predictable that modern scholars recognize much of it as political propaganda rather than fact. And in Tiberius's case, we have no neutral testimony from his lifetime, no letters from horrified servants, no shocked accounts from visitors, no official records of crimes. The lurid tales of swimming boys and systematic child abuse appear only in works written long after Tiberius was dead, when there was no danger of him retaliating. That doesn't mean he was innocent. Slavery and exploitation were a grim reality of Roman society, and unlimited power gave license to abuse. But the specific picture of Tiberius as a monstrous predator running child orgies on Capri was almost certainly exaggerated, created to fuel the Senate's hatred and to justify the damnation of his memory. Yet legends care little for accuracy. They live because they speak to something deeper than facts. What we can say with certainty is this: Tiberius ruled the empire from Capri for 10 years, without once setting foot in Rome again. In that time, he shifted from a capable, if harsh, administrator into a paranoid recluse who governed by rumor and executed on impulse. What Romans believed, and what they needed to believe, was far darker. They spoke of Villa Jovis, Tiberius's cliffside palace, as a place where the emperor surrendered to appetites that would shame demons. They whispered about the Spintriae, young men and women imported from across the empire, trained in exotic practices to satisfy his desires. They spread stories of the little fishes, boys trained to swim between the emperor's legs in his private pools, doing things too indecent for words. They imagined theaters where slaves and prisoners were forced into degrading performances for the emperor's amusement, only to be hurled from the cliffs when the show ended. Others swore that guests at imperial banquets were sometimes entertained, not with music or games, but with the screams of condemned criminals tortured before their eyes. And they said Tiberius's paranoia grew so intense that he surrounded himself with food tasters, poison experts, and astrologers, each tasked with examining his meals, his drinks, and even his visitors for signs of treachery. The most damning accusation against Tiberius was not that he was cruel, but that he had abandoned Rome itself. While barbarians pressed against the frontiers and conspirators schemed in the capital, the emperor was said to be amusing himself with toys on a private island, caring for nothing but his own indulgence. But if we strip away the sensational rumors, another image comes into focus, one far sadder than the lurid legends. Tiberius was probably not the sadistic monster later writers described. He was almost certainly a broken man. At 57 years old when he arrived on Capri, he had given his entire life to an empire that never loved him back. He had conquered Germania, governed Syria, and managed Rome itself with efficiency that brought him no gratitude. and competence that inspired no affection. His private life was a series of wounds. His wife, Vipsania, the only woman he truly loved, was taken from him for political reasons and forced to marry another man. His brother Drusus died young in Germania. His adopted son, Germanicus, was poisoned in Syria. His biological son, Drusus, died under suspicious circumstances in Rome. Every person he loved was taken from him. Every ally he trusted betrayed him. Every protege he advanced turned against him. By the time he reached Capri, Tiberius was less a ruler than a fugitive, a man not just escaping Rome, but fleeing the unbearable weight of a world that demanded everything from him and gave nothing in return. Did he indulge in excess? Almost certainly, to some extent. Isolation mixed with absolute power has always led to extremes. Did he grow more paranoid and arbitrary? Without doubt. The executions and endless treason trials prove as much, but the picture of Tiberius as a gleeful sadist running grotesque torture chambers is almost certainly myth, an invention of enemies who needed to justify their hatred of a ruler who, judged by the standards of his age, was competent but unloved. Meanwhile, Sejanus was busy becoming emperor in everything but name. The Praetorian prefect had consolidated control with surgical precision. He controlled access to Tiberius, screening every message that reached Capri and shaping every response that left it. He planted his allies in powerful positions, silenced rivals through exile, trials, or accidents, and convinced each side of government that he alone protected them. To the Senate, he was shielding them from Tiberius's paranoia. To Tiberius, he was shielding the emperor from senatorial treachery. Both sides trusted him, because both sides feared each other more than they feared him. By 29 AD, Sejanus was receiving honors usually reserved only for the emperor. His statues appeared in temples and theaters. His birthday was celebrated as a public holiday. Senators lined up to praise him, each trying to outdo the other in displays of loyalty. He was so close to supreme power, he could taste it. All he needed was one final excuse, a crisis, a conspiracy that would justify removing Tiberius permanently and allow him to rule as regent for the young heirs. But here, Sejanus made his fatal mistake. He believed Tiberius's retreat to Capri meant surrender, that the emperor had abandoned power, broken and indifferent. He was wrong. Tiberius might have been physically absent, but he was still a general, and generals do not surrender. His intelligence network remained intact. Spies, informants, and loyal agents continued to bypass Sejanus's filters through hidden channels he never suspected. Slowly, piece by piece, Tiberius began to uncover the full scale of his prefect's betrayal. The suspicious deaths of heirs, the steady promotion of Sejanus's allies, the isolation of loyalists, the clever campaign that kept emperor and senate locked in mutual fear. Sejanus had played brilliantly, but he had underestimated his master. Tiberius was not just a politician, he was a soldier, and soldiers know that the best victories are won with deception, patience, and overwhelming force applied at the perfect moment. Through 30 AD, Tiberius quietly laid his trap. Letters filled with exaggerated praise for Sejanus arrived in Rome more often. Honors and promotions flowed from Capri to the prefect. The emperor acted more dependent on him than ever before. Sejanus grew relaxed. His influence spread. His confidence soared. he began openly planning for power, perhaps a graceful retirement for the old emperor, a regency for the heirs, a grateful senate confirming their protector as Rome's new master. He never saw the blade. October 18th, 31st AD, the day history proved that monsters could still count. The Senate gathered for what seemed to be a routine meeting. Sejanus entered the curia, Julia dressed in the toga praetexta of high office, surrounded by loyalists and flatterers, desperate to walk closest to power. A letter from Tiberius was to be read aloud. The expectation was simple. Another message of thanks, more praise for the prefect, perhaps even new honors. Sejanus took his seat, basking in anticipation of the emperor's approval. The letter, read by Naevius Sutorius Macro, began in the usual way. Praise for Sejanus's loyalty, recognition of his service, acknowledgement of his devotion to Rome. The prefect smiled as the familiar phrases washed over the chamber. Then everything changed. The tone of Tiberius's letter, read aloud in the Senate, shifted suddenly. Praise gave way to doubt. Subtle criticisms began to creep in. Questions about decisions made, concerns over certain appointments, unease about policies that had once seemed unquestionable. The prefect's smile began to fade. Senators shifted in their seats, unsure whether to clap or sit in silence. But Macro kept reading, and the words only grew sharper. Criticism hardened into condemnation. Doubts turned into direct accusations. Questions became formal charges. Treason, conspiracy, betrayal. By the time the reading ended, the Senate chamber was silent. From an island 300 miles away, Tiberius had just destroyed the man who had once been his most trusted advisor. Sejanus looked around the room, desperate for support from the very men who had cheered him only hours earlier. He saw nothing but downcast eyes and nervous glances. In that moment, he discovered the true nature of power. It is more fragile than water, faster to vanish than wine spilled on stone. Macro, who had secretly replaced Sejanus as Praetorian prefect just days before, gave a single nod. Guards moved in immediately. The man who had ruled Rome in all but name was dragged away like a criminal. Within hours, Sejanus was dead. Within days, his allies followed. Within weeks, his entire family was executed. Within months, his name was erased from inscriptions and monuments. Tiberius had shown that distance meant nothing to his reach, that isolation was no barrier to revenge, and that betrayal would always be punished with interest. Sejanus's execution was not the end of the story, but the opening act in a blood-soaked finale that would dominate the last years of his reign. The paranoia that had once simmered quietly in Capri now erupted with unstoppable fury. If Sejanus, the closest friend, the most trusted advisor, could betray him, then no one was safe. The Great Purge began almost immediately. Anyone who had supported Sejanus, even by association, faced charges of treason. Anyone who had risen, thanks to his influence, was now a target. Even those who had publicly praised him suddenly found themselves in danger. Very quickly, the net widened. Senators who had criticized imperial policies, wealthy nobles who looked like rivals, historians whose writings praised the old republic. Anyone could be accused. Law was replaced by fear. A whisper from Capri became a death sentence in Rome. A bad horoscope could be twisted into proof of conspiracy. A careless comment at a dinner could be used as evidence of treason. Historians estimate that hundreds were executed in the purges. Senators, knights, aristocrats, their families, freedmen, even household slaves. Entire households were destroyed. The city fell silent. People learned to speak in half sentences. Dinner tables became schools of caution. Letters were written as though spies would read them, because they would. Children were told never to repeat their parents' names in public, for fear that idle talk could bring soldiers to the door. Rome, once a city of open debate in the Forum, became a city of whispers. Politics was now carried out in the shadows. Dissent shown only through silence, and behind it all, Tiberius remained on his island, signing death warrants as casually as tax decrees, sending orders as detached as weather reports. The emperor who had once fled Rome to escape its poisonous politics had become the most poisonous element in Roman politics himself. From 32 AD to 37 AD, the empire stumbled into its final chapter under Tiberius. After Sejanus's fall, the emperor never again trusted any single man with power. Instead, he relied on a shifting circle of advisors, spies, and executioners, each kept in check by fear of the others. He played them like pieces on a chessboard, with the cold precision of a master strategist and the suspicion of a man who trusted no one. The empire itself continued to function. Governors still ran the provinces. Legions guarded the borders. Taxes flowed steadily into the treasury. But Rome, the heart of the empire, was hollow, ruled by an absent emperor whose commands arrived from Capri in irregular bursts and were obeyed without question. The stories from this period, whether fact, exaggeration, or outright invention, paint a portrait of a man who had given up his humanity in exchange for control. It was said he trusted no one, not even his food tasters. Rumors claimed he rotated between villas on Capri, sleeping in a different bed every night to confuse potential assassins. The darker tales, the sexual accusations that would define his legacy, were said to come from these final, paranoid years. Ancient writers claimed that, cut off from normal human contact and convinced that everyone was either out to kill him or already his victim, Tiberius turned to increasingly bizarre and degrading sexual habits. Yet again, though, we need to step back and ask, where do these claims come from? They were written decades after his death by historians who described events that supposedly took place in total secrecy, reported by witnesses who, had they spoken during his lifetime, would have been executed. It is far more likely that the reality was different. The emperor's last years seem to have been marked less by sadistic pleasure and more by crushing loneliness, surrounded only by servants who feared him, guards who watched him, and advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. Tiberius became the ultimate prisoner of his own power. On March 16th, 37 AD, Tiberius Caesar died much as he had lived his final years, alone, suspicious, and watched by people eager to celebrate the moment he drew his last breath. The official cause of death was natural illness, most likely pneumonia or heart failure. At 77 years old, his health had been failing for months, but Roman historians, never ones to miss a dramatic flourish, added more colorful endings. Suetonius claimed he died while traveling from Capri back toward Rome, making one last attempt to return to the capital he had abandoned 11 years earlier. Tacitus hinted that Macro, the Praetorian prefect, may have hastened his end to ensure Tiberius couldn't change his chosen successor. The most dramatic stories went even further. that the emperor actually recovered briefly, sat up in bed asking for food, only to be smothered with his own sheets by attendants who had already announced his death and feared the revenge he would unleash if he lived. Whether he died of illness, was smothered by panicked guards, or was quietly eliminated by his successor, the outcome was the same. Rome's most reluctant emperor finally found the peace that had escaped him for 23 years of rule. News of his death reached the city before his body did. Celebrations began immediately. Tiberius left behind an empire strong on the outside, but scarred on the inside, its borders secure, its treasury full, but its politics poisoned by years of fear. His successor, Caligula, grandnephew of Tiberius and son of the adored Germanicus, was welcomed as a savior, the young leader who would restore dignity and end the terror of the old emperor's final decade. Yet, within months, Romans would look back on Tiberius's reign with reluctant nostalgia. Caligula's wild descent into madness made his predecessor's paranoia seem almost reasonable. But by then, Tiberius's reputation had already been set in stone. The soldier who secured Germany became remembered as the tyrant who crushed the Senate. The administrator who balanced the empire's finances was remembered as the recluse who abandoned Rome. The lonely man who withdrew to Capri became remembered as the perverse monster of lurid legend. History, as so often happens, preferred the dramatic lie over the complicated truth. So what truly happened on Capri? Was Tiberius the depraved villain of Roman rumor, or simply a broken man collapsing under the weight of absolute power? The truth is that we cannot know. The sources are too biased, the evidence too compromised, the time gap too wide for certainty. What we can say is this: Tiberius faced impossible choices and, under unbearable pressure, made increasingly poor ones. He inherited an empire that demanded divine authority from him, but gave him no loyalty in return. He dealt with senators who demanded respect while plotting against him, and citizens who demanded protection while despising his methods. The sexual accusations that still define his name are almost certainly exaggerated, if not fabricated outright. The political paranoia, however, was real enough, because conspiracies truly did exist, as Sejanus's betrayal had shown. Tiberius was neither the efficient administrator painted by his defenders, nor the sadistic monster drawn by his enemies. He was something far more dangerous and far more tragic, a man who began with competence, even decency, but was warped by absolute power and destroyed by isolation. His story is a reminder of why we must always question ancient sources, not just what they claim, but why they make those claims. Roman historians wrote with grudges, agendas, and audiences in mind. When they accused emperors of wild sexual crimes, we should ask, who made these claims? When were they written? And what was gained by telling them? In the case of Tiberius, the answers say less about the emperor himself and more about the political culture of Rome. The senators who lived in fear during his reign had every reason to explain that fear through shocking tales of depravity, and so, the man who ruled an empire of 60 million people for more than 2 decades was remembered less for what he did than for what his enemies wanted the world to believe. Historians, writing under later emperors, had strong incentives to highlight the virtue of their patrons by exaggerating the vice of their predecessors. That doesn't mean the old sources are useless. They still give us priceless insight into how Romans thought about power, morality, and legitimacy. But we have to read them as propaganda and political commentary just as much as history. Here's the part the textbooks rarely say out loud. This isn't just ancient gossip stored away in a museum case. It's still happening today. The island palaces haven't disappeared. They've just moved. Think of the private compounds, luxury jets, encrypted chat groups, and carefully managed social media feeds. The tools may look different, but the outcome hasn't changed. Isolation still breeds excess. Power still erodes empathy. Secrecy still invites cruelty. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Ordinary citizens have almost no visibility into what goes on in those spaces. We see the speeches, the staged photo ops, the official statements. What we don't see are the decisions, deals, and privileges that shape our lives behind closed doors. Calls get filtered, dissent gets silenced, and those far from power often pay the price for choices they never even knew were being made. So yes, maybe Tiberius was unfairly slandered, or maybe he really was monstrous. That debate will never be fully settled, but that's not the point. The point is that whether by rumor or reality, the same forces that broke him are alive in our world today. The lurid stories of cruelty and excess are frightening, but what's worse are the small, quiet decisions that pass unnoticed. Who is punished? Who is shielded? Who is ignored altogether? If you want to feel outrage, focus on the secrecy itself. If you want to feel fear, look at what unaccountable people are free to do when no one is watching. They don't have to act like monsters in public. Sometimes they just stop being human in private. That's not conspiracy talk. It's a civic warning. And the solutions aren't glamorous. Transparency, accountability, making sure the right people are in the room. People who care about the common good more than their own comfort. Boring fixes, yes, but boring doesn't mean unimportant. So judge Tiberius if you like, but don't imagine the story ended when he died. The same dynamics walk among us today, in suits, in uniforms, behind polished screens, and because so much stays hidden, the worst of it can remain buried for years. If you want these stories brought to light, without being sensationalized, without being sanitized, stick around, subscribe, and keep watching. Because history doesn't just repeat itself in headlines, it repeats in the rooms where decisions get made, and the rest of us aren't invited. So I'll leave you with this. Was Tiberius a victim, a tyrant, or something in between? And tell me, what modern palace do you think most needs sunlight?